Jesus criticized the Pharisees for losing sight of weightier matters. He chided the brothers in Corinth for not being mature enough for spiritual meat. We've had 2,000 years or so to learn from their mistakes, and still we struggle both at large in the brotherhood, but also more importantly on an individual basis to grow up spiritually sometimes. Something that we're still dealing with. And at North Collin, we don't want that to be the case. As a congregation, one of our goals is to be a church full of Christians who are striving to mature on an ongoing basis. We want to be a church full of Christians who are trying to reach our full potential individually as servants of God. We want to be a church full of meat eaters here. And so, as I was getting ready to prepare this sermon, like I say, we don't get to do this very often, those of us men in the congregation, especially now that we this often or in different format. And you get to pick whatever topic you want to pick whenever you're only doing it every now and then. The weekly preacher's got to come up with it every week, week in and week out. We get to pick, and I wanted to make sure and pick something that dealt with weightier matters. So as I was studying and praying and thinking about it, it occurred to me that Jesus and Paul were typically dealing with things that had to do with the heart when they talked about meaty subjects, weighty matters. Now, it is true that sometimes advanced doctrine would be referred to as weighty or meaty issues, but in reality, most of the time, they were dealing with matters of the heart. They were dealing with matters of personal, spiritual character. When we talk about character, we usually talk about it in terms of character is who you are when no one else is looking, right? But we know as Christians that that's not a thing. There's never a time when no one else is looking because God is always with us. And my encouragement this morning is that we need to start thinking about our personal spiritual character as being who we are when only God is watching. Who we are to God, the omniscient God, the holy judge. Our personal spiritual character is who we really are at the end of the day. Not who we're pretending to be, sometimes even to ourselves. Not who we wish we could be. Not who we are to the people around us who don't know what's going on inside. So, my goal this morning is for us to take a look at, spiritual character, how it affects our walk with God, but also some practical ways that we can, go ahead and improve our spiritual character. So, the first thing I want us to do is we're going to look at two main points, okay? Two main topics of interest. I want to establish, first of all, that character is important to us because it's what drives our thoughts and our words and our actions. And then secondly, I want to show that it's our thoughts and words and actions, as well as our character, not separate from it, that will determine where we spend our eternity. And then the third thing that we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at some practical ways to work on our spiritual character. Now, I'm not going to be saying a lot of things in this first part that are new or original or anything like that, but I do want us to spend a little bit of focused study on this idea that our character drives what we say and do and think, and it's that combination of our character, who we are on the inside, with our thoughts and words and actions, who we are on the outside, that are going to judge us in the last day. Now, Jesus taught that our character is at the heart of it all. Okay? He taught that it drives everything we do, and it starts from the inside and it works its way out, not the other way around. So if we look at Matthew chapter 7, and there's some of these passages we're going to look at, of course, in all the Gospels or in multiple Gospels, but I just like the way cases here that it's presented in Matthew. So we're going to kind of stay in Matthew a lot today. Matthew chapter 7, if we look in verse 16, Jesus is talking about recognizing the fruit in others, but today we're not talking about what other people do. We're talking about ourselves. So he says, you will recognize them by their fruits. So for us today, we will recognize ourselves by our own fruits. And he asks the question, are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? In other words, does a plant produce fruit that's contrary to its very genetic nature? Every healthy tree bears good fruit, but a diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a diseased tree cannot bear good fruit. We define the quality of a tree by the quality of its fruit. On the other hand, we know that the fruit is actually just kind of one, although the main way to judge a tree, it's just one of the ways you can tell whether a tree is healthy or not. And we're going to be kind of looking at that concept today. But it's the health of the tree that's important at the end of the day. Matthew chapter 12, turn over there. Jesus goes a little further with this idea. In Matthew chapter 12, beginning at verse 34, he says, "For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. The good person out of his good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil." So now he's letting us know specifically, in this case, that the words that come out of our mouth come from our heart. He takes it even further. Flip over a couple pages to Matthew chapter 15. In Matthew 15, we go to verse 18. It says, "What comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander. These are what defile a person." So now he's gone on to give us some other things that come from the heart. Not just words, but thoughts and actions. And we're not going to take the time to go through the Sermon on the Mount, but he talks a lot about in the Sermon on the Mount about the relationship between the heart and the actions that we take. The relationship between things like lust and adultery, or anger and murder. And he lets us know that if we can develop who we are on the inside, we can nip those sins in the bud before they ever become a reality. Jesus' brother James talked about this as well. Turn over to James chapter 1. And this is just a wonderful passage that we need to be familiar with, because James is not blaming anything on the devil. In James chapter 1, he says, "Each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." So these men have let us know in no uncertain terms that what we think and say and do is a direct result of who we are on the inside. Okay? And that's the first thing I wanted us to take a look at. Now, the second thing I want us to look at is that it's the combination of who we are on the inside and who we are on the outside that's going to determine our final destination. So obviously it's a big deal. And at this point, it doesn't do us any good. You know, when you're preparing a sermon, it can become an intellectual exercise. You start finding yourself coming up with neat ways to say things, or, slick ways to tie this point to that point. And if you're not careful before you realize it, you've created a really neat technical document, and it's not going to do anybody any good. You look at it as a whole, realize this is not going to help anyone, and everyone to tears. So at this point, as we talk about judgment and the importance of character on judgment, I want to make it clear that we need to put this into action. This is important for us to seriously consider. We need to be real about it. So I'm just going to say a couple of things, and they are what they are. In the church, and again, it's a generalization, but we have a tendency, and this lesson is for us, the people here today, to focus on our fruits being the measure by which we will be judged. And it is true that that is the case. But we have a tendency to downplay the importance of the heart the emotion, the thought in our judgment. And we need to not be doing that. Okay, so we know this, and we talk about it a lot more today than it was talked about 25 years ago when I was a kid. So we're making improvements on this, but it is a reality that we need to be aware of our hearts. We're going to turn over to Matthew 15 again. In verse 7, Jesus said, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" It's not going to do us any good to be okay on the outside, but not be okay on the inside. That's not how this works. Hebrews chapter 4. The writer of Hebrews makes it clear that the scriptures are going to separate every component of us for judgment. Our hearts, our minds, our actions, our words. He says, "The word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow, discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. No creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account." We need to be constantly reminding ourselves that it is possible to do good things on the outside and still be lost because of who we are on the inside. When we're evaluating ourselves, we need to take time to step back and focus on the health of the tree instead of the sweetness of the fruit. Now, it's kind of simple. Do you know who loves you in your life? This isn't complicated. When God is passing judgment, he's going to know who knows him and loves him, and he's going to know who doesn't. We're not going to get into technicality. We're not going to get into heaven on a loophole. We're going to get into heaven because God is good and merciful towards us. He loves us and he wants to be with us, and he's going to simply look at our lives and make a determination as to whether or not we were faithful. But you're not going to be able to stand in front of God on Judgment Day and say, "Well, I checked off all the boxes." God is going to say, "I never knew you." We don't want that to happen. Now, on the other hand, as we go out into the world, we're constantly dealing with people in the denominational world who tend to focus a lot on our hearts and downplay the importance of fruit in our lives. And nowadays, it's gotten even worse than that. We hear a lot of people focusing less on their heart and more on just their intent. The things that are being done by people who claim to be Christians in 2019 are absolutely absurd and ludicrous. It's not okay. We have people telling us how much they love the Lord, and they are living like absolute heathens. And that is not acceptable to God. We know this. We turn over to Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Jesus said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father in heaven." Not the one who thought about doing it or thought it was neat. Not the one who intended to do it but never got around to it. That's just a fact. Now, the ironic thing is that whether we're a person who is falling on one side of the coin or the other, the answer is the same. Your tree, whether you're a person who is not focusing on, or whether you're a person who thinks the tree is important but isn't doing any good deeds, we both need to get back to the health of that tree if we want to be right with God, if we want for God to know that we love him. Now, Jesus, when you put his teachings together, what he said is that we need to worship and by extension live every day in spirit and truth. We need to do the right things for the right reasons. He said that if we love him, we'll keep his commandments, starting with loving God and loving our fellow man. Leading then next to things like justice and mercy, but flowing all the way down to the smallest thing, that tithing of mint and cumin and dill. Not to abandon those small things either. That's the message that Jesus delivered. He taught a message of following of God with any of the things that God expects. He taught us to be faithful to the one we love, to act like human beings who love God. He didn't say that you can have an attitude of, well, I'll do these things, but I don't want to. He didn't say, well, that sounds like a good idea, but I'm really not ready to give up on this thing yet. How about if I do 2 of these things instead? We are expected to act like people who love the Lord. James talked about this in James chapter 2. If we turn over to James chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, he said, someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Verse 26, as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. We have to be balanced. We have to be the complete package, just like we would expect of anybody else in our lives who says they love us. We have to act towards God the way we want people to act towards us if they claim to be in love with us. Now, having said all of this about balance, before we move on to some solutions, I want to point something out. The reality of it is that a lot of what I just said is kind of theoretical anyway, because if you actually really get to know a person, it's going to become apparent that if they say they love the Lord but they're not doing good things, you know that what they're telling you isn't true. That's why we're told to judge fruit. Likewise, a person who is doing all things on the outside but isn't right inside, you're going to eventually find out they're not really doing all the right things. You really, in reality, would have a very hard time behaving properly but being totally broken on the inside. You know, we need to be very careful about fence-sitting. What I'm getting. The reality about fence-sitting is that God knows the secrets of the heart. And he's watching everything that we do. He knows what we're thinking. He knows what we're feeling. These situations where we fence it are mortally dangerous to us. And the reason for that is that this is where we get into things like secret despair, secret sin, hypocrisy, being overly judgmental towards others and cutting ourselves slack that we're not cutting them. We begin to see the world through our own eyes, and we assume that everybody is doing the same things that we're doing, the same failings that we're having. Some of you at least have been through that, or someone else who's going through that. And that to focus on the tree and its health if we want to get out of that. Because if we keep faking it, it's not going to go well, both here and at judgment. Jesus gave advice to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23. In verse 25, he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they're full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and plate, so that the outside also may be clean." The solution is to work on the inside so that the outside will be fixed, not try to work from the outside in. All right, so what are some practical ways then that we can build our character? The first thing that I would say is that we need to set aside some time to honestly evaluate our hearts. Just set aside some time to meditate on it, to think about it, to do an honest evaluation. Paul urged the Corinthian brethren to examine themselves to see whether or not they were in the faith. And he also told them they needed to test themselves. That's 1 Corinthians 13:5 there. The author of Lamentations urged the Israelites to test and examine their ways. And he told them they need to return to the Lord. So it's common advice from spiritual leaders that on a regular basis, God's people need to test themselves and they need to examine themselves. And if they find themselves like, they need to correct it. They need to return to the Lord. So how do we do that? Well, we already know the first thing you do is a quick fruit inspection. You just need to take a look, see what's going on in our actions, in our words, in our thoughts. And our thoughts are actions, remember. We need to take a look at those things. And obviously, if we see a problem, we know there's a problem inside if there's already a problem on the outside. But we especially need to look to our private thoughts and our attitudes when we're doing this kind of a examination. What are the kinds of things I'm thinking about but not saying and doing? What are the kinds of things that I'm feeling whenever these situations come up, and why? What's going on with me? We need to have, just an honest, deep evaluation to ensure that we're not just going through the motions. That's something that needs to be done by all of us on a regular basis. Now, I will also tell you that I think it's important, if possible, to go to a brother or sister who knows us really well and ask them for some input. And that's hard to do and that's scary to do, but if somebody knows us well, they may be able to give us some insight on some things that we're missing for some reason. Some good things and some bad things. But I think that that's an important step to take. Now, as far as self-evaluation is concerned, the key to that is knowing in advance, going into it, that there's always going to be something that we can improve. Kind of helps us handle it a little bit better. Is to know going into it, of course I'm going to have some areas that I can do better at. And more importantly, we need to remember that God has given us this day to prepare for judgment. It's a mercy. The time that the Lord gives us is one of his greatest mercies because he's allowing us to learn. He's allowing us to grow. He's allowing us to repent when necessary. He's on our side. He's not out to get us. He's out to save us. He expects that you can do it. He believes that you can do it. He wants you to do it. And so when we approach this self-evaluation, it doesn't need to be from a standpoint of, well, give me the bad news. It needs to be, there's going to be bad news, but God's going to help me fix it. My brothers and sisters are going to help me fix it. James promised that when we draw near to God, he will what? He will draw near to us. And we know from God's history that that is the case. That's what he does. The second thing that we can do is we need to then be purposeful and mindful. Once we know there's an issue, it's a little bit easier to notice when that issue's surfacing. And there are things that we can do then to catch ourselves and kind of nip problems in the bud. I put Ephesians 5, verses 15 through 17 up there, where Paul encourages us to make the best use of our time. We need to focus on these things. We need to set aside time to make sure that we start to learn trigger bad thoughts in our minds, what things cause us to maybe behave in ways that we wouldn't normally want to behave, but especially just those attitudes as they surface. And it's easier to do once you've done the self-evaluation because you're now on the lookout. The third thing that I would say we can do is stop focusing on producing better fruit as the sole way to improve our character. Bad habit of trying to fix the inside by fixing the outside. And Jesus said that's not how it works. You fix the outside by fixing the inside. Now, I'm not saying there aren't times where, as we say, fake it till you make it. I'm not saying that there aren't times where you just need to do what you're supposed to do while you're working on things. But what I'm saying is that that's not the only way to get it done, and it's not the main way to get it done. We can't just focus on the fruit. We've got to focus on what's going on with our tree. And Sean has told you, Dad used to talk about us being fruit inspectors. But what I'm saying is we need to be arborists. We need to be experts in tree health when it comes to ourselves. Because we can't do anything when it comes to other people but inspect the fruit. We don't know what they're thinking. We don't know what they're feeling. We have no idea what's going on with them. All we know is what we see and what we hear. But when it comes to ourselves, we know what's going on inside. And we have that extra opportunity to focus on tree health. And then the fourth thing that I've got here as a help as we improve our character is to focus on spending as much time as possible with God and His people. We've got to feed the tree good things. The importance of prayer and study and spending time with the brethren cannot be overstated, and we're not going to even get into that in this lesson. We'll be here all day. But we know that if we immerse ourselves in spiritual situations, spiritual conversations, spiritual activities, our hearts will be overwhelmed with good things, and we will not be able to help but become more like Jesus every day. If we feed the tree good things, we're going to get good results. If we starve the tree, we're going to get a sick tree, and eventually that tree's going to die. Worse yet, if we feed the tree bad things by being around people that feed us improper thoughts and actions, if we're watching things and listening to things that we shouldn't be listening to, what do we think is going to happen to the tree? What we feed the tree is going to determine how healthy the tree is. So, as we close today, I hope that this is, an encouraging message for all of us. I mean, we always say this when we prepare a lesson, that it's more benefit to me than it is to you, and that is the case. I mean, I'm extremely humbled by my studies over the last week or so, because there are a lot of things in my life that I've kind of mentally put on the back burner that I know need to be handled. And this study has revealed that, I need to be more serious about that. But I hope for you too that, it's encouraging, and that you can leave here and you can have, both a mission of improvement, but also a positive feeling that that your brothers and sisters and your God are going to help with this. It's not meant to be a come down on us lesson. It's meant to be, hey, we need to work on this, and we can do it. But having said that, I want to say two things that are going to get in our way. As soon as we get a good intent, we know that that's a time when Satan does like to prey on us, to derail our efforts. And there are two reasons that I believe we fail to focus on tree health, that as we go out and we're working on this over the next days and weeks, we want to be aware of. First of all, ironically, the less meaty, the less weighty issues are sometimes mentally challenging to get a handle on. So we tend to focus sometimes on less weighty issues more than we ought to. It can get way out of control. And then the time that we have, that resource, that precious time, is spent on things that it ought not be spent on. So fundamental issues of church structure and how we spend our money and mechanics of worship and things like that, indispensably important. But there's sort of an on and off switch on those. You either do it or you don't do it. We weren't meant to be spending 75% of our time and resources on those fundamentals. We were meant to spend the bulk of our time on becoming better people. So one thing I want to, remind us of is that it's very easy, if we're not purposeful about our priorities, to find that we have squandered our time in ways that we shouldn't have. And again, I'm not saying we don't spend time on those things. We don't need to have that monopolize our time. The second reason that we sometimes don't focus on tree health is simply that it's uncomfortable to focus on it. It's easier to focus on things that we do as a group together. It's easier to focus on things that we're maybe already doing right than it is to look inward and find ourselves lacking. So let's make sure that as we go out and we work on this, that we don't allow ourselves to put things on the back burner because they're uncomfortable to deal with, and instead go spend a bunch of time on things that we already kind of know what we're supposed to be doing anyway. We need to prioritize properly how we spend our time and how we spend our energy.